After a day of shooting at the range, you've probably expended a lot of expensive ammo, so save that brass and reload those rounds. I recently bought a Lee Classic turret press and began enjoying manufacturing rounds, experimenting, and saving some money too. The Lee 4-hole turret is easy to set up, and once you get the rhythm, you can knock out a few boxes in an hour while listening to some good tunes or your favorite talk radio. Once you've securely mounted the turret frame, lay out all the dies and other parts. I placed the 4 dies in order from right to left, as well as the shell holder and primer arm. Dies 3 and 4 look similar. It's easy to tell them apart by looking at the base. If you accidentally switch them, here's what can happen to your test round. If they are correctly mounted, you'll get a perfect round. I've marked the turret disc holes with a marking pen to clarify the procedure. Also note how the black plastic primer bracket is mounted on the bolt to the right. First, mount the primer arm, in this case a small pistol primer, and drop it into the slot. Then slide in the shell holder. Raise the ram about halfway and rotate the first hole into position. Take die number 1, the sizing and decapper die. Make sure that the pin top is even with the top of the die, and screw it in until it touches the shell holder. Then hand tighten the lock nut. Before you insert die 2, the expanding and powder die, install a riser into the top of the die. Then insert the die until it touches the shell holder. Back out the die 1 full turn, and because we're loading magnum rounds, add an additional 1 3/4 turn. I've marked the die with a marker to keep track. Then hand tighten the lock nut. Now place a case into the shell holder and run it all the way in to check the flare. Nope, not enough to hold the bullet. So run the die in a little more until the bullet sits comfortably on the case. Now load die 3, the bullet seating die, but first make sure the top adjusting screw is unscrewed till you see threads. Screw it in until it touches the shell holder and then back it out 3 full turns. Because we're reloading magnums, back it out another 1 3/4 turns. Then secure the locking nut. Take a factory round and insert it all the way into the die and screw the top adjustment in until it touches the top of the round. Next, install die 4, the crimp die, until it touches the shell holder, and secure the lock nut. Insert a factory round and screw in the adjusting screw until you can feel it touch the case mouth. Then back off a half turn for a light crimp. You can increase the crimp by backing out the adjustment. Now let's install the powder measure system. Screw the body onto the riser, making sure the O-ring is installed. Then take the appropriate measure disc, we'll be using the .40 hole, to get 4.7 grains of powder. Align the appropriate slot on the disc bottom to the pivot pin. Then mount the powder hopper so you can see the powder drop hole and tighten the nuts. Now let's put some small pistol primers into the primer tray and shake it until the primers are upright. There's always one or two culprits. Drop the primer flanges into the bracket. Now we're ready to add some powder. Make sure the powder hopper is off. Then add your powder. Turn the hopper on. Next, take a case that has a spent primer in it and run at least 5 loads through it. Take the 5th load and measure it. In our case, it should measure 4.7 grains. Now let's go through the loading process slowly. Place a case in the shell holder and run it into die number 1. The spent primer will fall into the plastic tube under the turret. Then push a new primer into the primer holder and lower the ram all the way to seat the primer. Sometimes I have to hold the case while inserting the primer. This is how the primer should look, flush with the case end. Now die 2 charges the case with powder and expands its neck. Place a bullet on the case and run it up into die 3, which seats the bullet. This bullet has a cannelure, which indicates a good seating depth. Then run it into die 4, the crimp die. We want a slight crimp on our round. Finally, I always check the finished round before accepting it. I usually take my first test round and mic it. Here we'll compare it to a factory round. All the specs are in the Lee loading manual. All right, let's load a few rounds. I never rush the process. It's like tap dancing. If you find yourself getting out of step, take a break from it. Also, I check my powder charge for consistency about every dozen rounds. Finally, I use old boxes to store the rounds, and I mark the reloading data on the box. Now let's secure the equipment after we're done reloading. Turn the powder hopper off, and take a spent case and run it through die number 2 until it stops discharging powder, usually about 5 times. Then unfasten the hopper and empty the powder. Take the disc and blow off the excess powder. Usually I blow out the hopper over my lawn because smokeless powder makes great fertilizer. Also, some powders will stick to the plastic and etch the powder hopper. Finally, I stick a note on the turret to remind me of the setup. Now it's time to hit the range and see just how good these rounds perform. Well, at least I see a hole in the target.